treasure she brings them from. Like we know each other. Like we're supposed to have her. Yeah, like
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Evening at Egan Lecture Series, where the University of Alaska Southeast welcomes our community to learn alongside us. Yake hat ade. It is good that you have come here, especially in all of this weather. So thank you, and thank you to those who are joining us on YouTube. We hope that you're warm and dry at home. This year, our focus of this series is inviting speakers and panels and groups who can help us think about the familiar in new ways. And so we're so excited about our speaker tonight, who is going to do that with us. Please grab food, snacks, feel free to get up during the talk. There are restrooms through the snacks over here on your left. And there's an emergency exit there on the back, which hopefully we will not need to use. After I introduce our speaker, although I saw from her working the crowd that she already knows many of you, we'll have Ernestine Hayes speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for some questions. And then afterwards, I will invite you over, if you have time, there's a open mic night put on by the AAPI Student Club right after this, in case you want to continue the party. So I'll begin with a brief land acknowledgement. Our campus resides on the unceded territory of the Occoquan on Tlingit Ani, also known as Juneau and Douglas, Alaska. We acknowledge that Tlingit peoples have been stewards of the land on which we work and reside since time immemorial, and we are grateful for that stewardship and incredible care. We are so glad to be welcoming Professor Emerita Ernestine Hayes back to UAS. She has been a student and faculty member and a key part of our campus community for decades. Holding a Master of Fine Art in Creative Writing from the University of Alaska Anchorage, and even more importantly, a degree from UAS. Hayes has been honored with numerous prestigious awards, beginning with a 2002 Alaska Native Writer Award for fiction from the Anchorage Daily News. In 2007, she was a finalist for both the Kiriyama Prize and the PEN USA Nonfiction Award for her memoir, Blonde Indian, which also earned her an American Book Award and the Honoring Alaska Indigenous Literature Award. Professor Hayes continued her excellence in writing with a 2014 Alaska Literary Award, and in 2016 were named Alaska State Writer Laureate, which they held until 2018. Right around this time, Professor Hayes published The Tao of Raven, an Alaskan Native memoir, which explores, among other things, her journey to becoming a professor at UAS. At UAS, she received the Faculty Excellence in Research and Creative Activity Award and was known for her caring and amazing mentorship of both students and other faculty. Ernestine's artistic achievements were further recognized with the Rasmussen Artist Residency in 2015 and the Rasmussen Foundation Distinguished Artist Award in 2021. Most recently, in 2023, she was honored with the United States Artist Fellowship, and now the 2024 Luce Indigenous Knowledge Fellow, which I think we'll learn a little bit more about tonight. On top of this, if this weren't enough, she has written and published numerous essays, stories, children's books, and others writing. Gunish Tish, Ernestine Hayes, for joining us today and sharing your work.
It's so good to be here, to see so many familiar faces. I won't say old faces. and meet some new friends. So thank you for coming in the middle of a winter storm warning and a flood watch. But as someone said, we're Alaskans, no big deal, right? So especially thank you, and thanks to those who are joining us online. It's exciting to read from work in progress, and some of the work that I'm sharing is long, slow progress, and some of it, the essay, the main essay that I'll be sharing, I just wrote this past summer, so, but the rest of it is pretty old. The old stories in my talk might also be termed ancient, and at my age, both terms are relative. So I'm first going to begin reading a couple of short old vignettes about dancing, and I call them old because it was almost 40 years ago, and I was almost 40, which I think is poetic. Sierra Nevada foothills. Around about midnight, I call shotgun on a pickup named Come On Now, and we're on our way to Tahoe. Dark roads hover above the spinning earth. Tonight, cats that look like white ghosts don't sacrifice their heads beneath our tires. Deer don't hear their last moments crunch against a front grill crusted with gas-flavored blackberries and gold mine bugs. Blacked out drunks don't climb into head-on Buicks, never to remember one thing about that night. Nothing but lodgepole pines and riverbeds. Pinpoint stars and cobalt sky, boulders glowing black, and then the lake. One quick trip to low-down slots with nothing left to lose but hoarded pennies, empty boxes, scattered hopes, dances that call back the stolen light. Yuba River. Yuba River nighttime on Hitchhike Highway 20, Nevada stars hard scratch the California night. Old trails sidestep lodgepole pines while down at the Crazy Horse and off the shoulder, off the chart, off the rocks, red dress keeps the cue ball hot. When that Virgo man takes his corner shot, this honky-tonk woman hits the floor. Jukebox woman, no doubt, but I can do one thing, one time, one day at a time, and tonight that one thing is this. I remember that red dress. I remember that dance floor. I remember that dance. Now, those are ancient stories. Thank you. They've been with me a long time, and the stories I read next have been with me even longer. The story of the woman who married a bear has always been central to my writing and to my own story, my own lived story, in great part because I learned early in my life that brown bear hear you when you say things. I've written, spoke, and read about that woman, and a few years ago I began a storied memoir written from her point of view, taking place long after the betrayal that led to her husband's death. Here she talks about stories she hears in the forest and about her own story as she reminisces about those times when they first met. In quiet moments, I walk again along the riverbeds and shores I walked with him. I find abandoned homes. I creep into unsheltered houses to learn if parts of me are still there. I find scattered words, discarded hopes. I welcome warm rain and cold air and arrange a deathbed to fill my gaze with one last glimpse of home. Fat days and shortened nights. These are the ways I age. A boy runs toward me from the distance and swerves away, low, fast, hungry. Canopy swaying eagles, warning berries, trembling ravens, laughing Delphin and Gabe, running, ever running low, not see Clené searching for rest. Gabe runs across the cradled tundra. Delphin swims always to shore. Not see Clené grieves for his wife's brothers. The boy who can't stop running sometimes runs through the spoken forest near where I now live. Sometimes he runs close. Sometimes he looks my way. He brings a cold wind. I live on the edge of that forest, here at the hem of two worlds, next to the mountain, next to the forest and ocean. My family, for whom I watched my husband die, for whom I killed two brothers, for whose sake I remain at the edge of this shape-shifted life, have left me at the margin where each generation must abandon the one before it, must leave them to test their scars, their scabs, their contingent unhealed wounds, as I join all the children and men and women who gather in the forest at night and listen to our distant songs. I had never before wondered if that woman's bare husband had survived in human form, his aspect, his apparition. I knew his bare form had been killed, but I also knew his human form still had stories to tell. She says of him, "The man I loved so many years ago still lives in the forest. He strokes his own cheek, not concerning himself with witless humanity. He counts my failures and prepares to take word of my blunders to the unshifted world, to report my wrongdoings to those who keep our histories and our songs, to those whose shapes no longer shift. We both know the crying woman. We both know the men who bring wealth. We know the man who carved our relatives into being. We know the boy who runs. We know all those who keep our songs and stories. We know who enters unprotected houses. We know they never bring food. The woman who married a bear, her bear husband, eagles, ravens, shapeshifters, all are such familiar old stories, telling familiar old lives. Here in Southeast Alaska, we live with those stories, and bears and ravens. People, bears, ravens, eagles, wolves, and stories. We all live together. At the instant a bear thinks of climbing the dark, uneasy hill to nuzzle under a flea-bitten porch in dirt-packed, cool, damp earth, to listen to human voices calling for the dog and dream of waterfalls. At that same moment, a raven blinks awake and calls the light. Ravens get their start long before daylight in summers and dark winters. It's an ancient story that connects us to unmeasured time. Raven calling back the Lazarus light. I feel my way through shadows and stumble against empty, scattered boxes to join Raven as he dances back the dawn. I soothe myself with a few close signs, a few sounds, ravens calling for early light, signs of bear in the Yana 8 patch. Had I lived in other places, I would have other stories to tell. For the past years, My mornings have been filled with the conspiracies of downtown ravens. I watch them call the dawn, and it brings back thoughts of Raven. I wrote this next essay for First Nations Luce Indigenous Knowledge Fellowship, whose generous program supports Indigenous intellectual and creative expression. The fellowship began in 2019 and saw its first cohort in 2020, which included our own Dr. Kune Twitchell, who also generously looked over my essay for signs, and he promised he would tell me if he saw glaring signs and glaring issues, and he said it was okay, so I send my thanks to him. And I also thank Dr. Kathy Connor, who was my geology teacher when I was an undergraduate here at UAS, and she also gave me a pass too, so I didn't have any glaring geology issues, so you can be comfortable about that. So the old story, the common story goes that Raven turned himself into a pine needle, and he caused himself to be swallowed by a young woman when she walked down the path from her unbreakable house to get herself water from the freshwater stream. After years and years of hearing, reading, writing, and telling that story, it finally came to me. We already had fresh water when Raven brought us daylight. I had never thought of that. So then I thought, well, when Raven was tricking Ganuk and stealing fresh water, and he got stuck in the smoke hole before he escaped, and that was when his feathers turned black. It came to me when Raven gave us fresh water, he had already given us fire. So I put it together. Raven had given us daylight, and before that he gave us water, and before that, he gave us fire. And that's what led me to my essay that I share with you now, Pleistocene Raven. Raven was white when he gave us fire. The land was still covered with ice. We fermented pop-in-your-mouth eggs of fish to eat raw. We sprinkled black seaweed with clear water from capricious don't-touch-me ice. How will we remember these years? Will we remember data and statistic, specific and precise? Will we dream of landfills and pandemics and tell stories of the grotesque? Or will we remember that our histories are 10,000 years old? We learn from watching the world and have always done so. We watch the budding flower of a dandelion surrender to the charms of spring, open its bloom to deer and sparrow, release its generations, and die. We watch rivers swell and glaciers retreat. We become curious. We wonder. We test ideas and connect them. We innovate. We explore. We learn. We place our intellectual discoveries into boxes of knowledge. We place into those boxes of knowledge our observations, the results of our studies, our assessments of predictable outcomes, the intellectually sound conclusions we learn from watching the world, our gathered, analyzed, organized indigenous knowledge, calling the light to each generation in long-established indigenous custom developed over thousands of years and hundreds of generations. Boxes of knowledge contain indigenous tradition, experience, judgment, custom, and belief, transmitted from generation to generation, clothed in metaphor and rooted in place. These boxes are seeds of knowledge planted deep in the soil of lived generations that burst into stories of amazing things we have seen. Our stories speak of shape-shifted bears, firehawks, trickery, and prodigal stars. We tell stories of death and birth, happiness and grief, loss, revenge, sacrifice, love, stories of journey and return. We sing, we carve, we write, we gather, we tell history. Story, history, language, custom, kinship, metaphor, all these things emerge from place, as does Raven, constantly emerging from a forested, narrow land that raises welcoming hands to islanded ocean, a land sheltered by mountains and ice fields, land robed in hemlock and flood, cataclysm and fern. Visions carve and weave themselves onto cedar, onto spruce, into tradition. Cataclysm becomes history. History becomes story. Sorry. Wow, I got a long way. Visions carve and weave themselves onto cedar, onto spruce, into tradition. Cataclysm becomes history. History becomes story. Names of person, house, and clan are remembered for 1,000 years. When names fall away, Raven steps onto the beach. One of Raven's gifts, the one they call the Ring of Fire, danced on the ocean floor before time immemorial erupted on our shores. Ocean levels were lower then, ice sheets at their maximum. People wandered lost, following wolves, searching for fire and fresh water, hoping for sunlight. Most of them didn't make it to that narrow, still cold land dotted with seaweed, beach grass, and rock. Corridor walls gave loud, sudden warnings and crushed mothers' frozen arms still wrapped around a treasured child. Grandmother's bones covering them both. Fathers, sons, and brothers all gone long ago, sucking scraped ice to calm their empty bellies and comfort loosened teeth. Across the last gasp of glacial retreat, a still hopeful bare number of women and children straggled toward that narrow shore dotted with seaweed and beach grass, where Raven, walking along the beach, notices fire in the distant ocean. At last they came to that narrow refuge between ocean and ice, a thin family who finally sighted salt water and seagulls after who knows how long, only to find people already living on those shores. People come before them by way of constant ocean, like traders riding high water carrying obsidian and fur, like travelers walking a low water beach, like Raven. Grandmothers spoke to children of wolves and ravens, leading to day-old kills, marrow bones for babies to suck, fur to wrap reddened hands, feathers to soften hard sleep. Old women tossed empty bones to hungry wolves and curious ravens never far away. Through the dark winter, they filled empty bellies with stories of daylight and cataclysm, fresh water and fire, stories that described to children their places in the world. Ravens and wolves planted stories of everything they had seen. Stories are told of the ice sheet advancing for several hundred years before again retreating, its path written in buried ash and unburied bones told over warm fires in low hidden caves. In every generation since, an ancient history of fires erupting in distant oceans and tephra falling from dark skies has been told and retold in long storied cycles that bear witness to the cultures Raven tells. Raven cycles comprise enough stories to fill lifetimes of dark nights. One ancient story tells of Raven's theft that brought light to the world. Another tells of his theft that brought streams and rivers of fresh water spilling from his mouth. Another tells of his deception when he sent hawk to retrieve fire from a distant ocean. Scholarly journals study the Raven cycle. Countless children's books entertain, and all of them recount Raven's trickeries that brought stars and moon and sun into a darkened world. Like eagles and wolves and mountains and wind, stories of Raven and his grandfather's boxes of light emerged from and danced with the land. I don't remember the first time I heard about Raven. He has always been familiar and nearby. I lived with my grandmother for the first several years of my life, and she didn't tell me stories as much as she described my place in the world. In the story of Stolen Daylight, when Raven cries to his reluctant grandfather for precious boxes of light, I pictured myself a child longing for a treasure out of my reach. When I became a grandmother, I pictured myself giving daylight to my generations, should they ask. Years and later heartbreak taught me to think about a mother and a grandfather left alone in that dark house, themselves heartbroken at the loss of their precious child. I now imagine Raven returning to that dark house, bringing back the light he stole. I picture that dark house made light with Raven's return. I picture humanity living together in a darkened house, waiting for the return of stolen light. Stories are told and repeated, written on paper and stone tablets, on carved poles and petroglyphs. Earth writes stories with storms, snowfall, floods. Mountains, craters, and ocean floors tell stories to themselves, to one another, to caves and glaciers, and to us. Western-trained scholars learn ways to read stories told by soil and rock and buried bones, and then to interpret those stories to themselves, to us, and to one another. They tell stories of comets and sunspots at the end of a Pleistocene ice age, bringing volcanic eruptions on the seafloor and forming islands of lava in distant oceans. Western knowledge keepers speak of a time when glaciers retreated, streams and rivers formed, ashes settled, and birds and animals put away their winter color. They tell stories of a changing sky. Western knowledge gatherers, variously referred to in academic custom as researcher, archaeologist, expert, and explorer, trace their beliefs to the centuries-old teachings of ancient thinkers in European motherlands. One fundamental precept is the theory, my own eyes, occasionally cited as my own thought or our own discoveries. A theory that requires belief in and practice of the thought ritual methodic doubt, which itself invites continual testing and research until journey meets craft, whereupon the apprentice may assert, my own eyes. This skepticism leads to denial of all that has elsewise been seen. Nevertheless, knowledge gatherers trained in the tradition of Western peoples read stories told on land and written in the air, stories told by mountains, in caves, and on ocean floors. Their stories speak of cataclysm, flood, fire, darkness. Their storytellers say that ice once covered the land that calls itself Llingit Ani, all the way to narrow tidelands. Western knowledge keepers tell of a great ice sheet beginning a slow retreat, loosening its cold grip on a defiant, still jagged mountain peak, uncovering a long frozen stream bed, then all at once again rushing forward for reasons that differ with each teller. Their knowledge keepers all agree, though, that the story they call the Younger Dryas follows their much longer traditional story they call the Pleistocene. These are the histories of the Pleistocene cycle, as told by Western knowledge keepers, those wise ones who read stories told by Earth in layers of ash, in volcanic chemical strata long since absorbed and long since cleansed, in layers of tephra buried beneath prismatic soil, beneath unswallowed pine needles, and among grandmothers' bones. Fires are burning worldwide. Everywhere grass grows, fires burn. Volcanoes erupt on mountain tops and ocean floor. Tephra, erratics, alluvial fans, and craters tell stories of worldwide disruption at the conclusion of the Pleistocene cycle. Knowledge keepers count the geologic blink by which they honor the flowering Rosa as 12,000 Julian years in time before present. Many ages ago, Western knowledge keepers say, before their ages of Megahalayan and North Grippian, even before their age of Greenlandian, the ice sheet their ancients call Cordilleran ceased to advance, then unexplainably moved forward again. After 9 centuries, more than 12,000 years by their count, Cordilleran retreated again, this for the final time. Traditional Western knowledge gatherers safeguard these sacred stories of that long ago Tarantian age. They are called the stories of the Younger Dryas. In Western tradition, they are told at the end of the cycle of the epoch of the Pleistocene. These Pleistocene histories tell of an at long last glacial retreat interrupted for less than the blink of a geologic eye by volcanoes on land and ocean floor and firestorms worldwide. whether by comet or by sunspot, when earth erupted and lands burned, Raven saw fire on a distant water and sent Hawk to bring fire to the world. Raven walks along the beach, curious like always. Deep smoke and high thick ash explode on distant waters. Raven examines the fiery mystery, first tilting his head this way, then tilting it that way, then walking along the melting beach in this direction and that. He measures the distance and weighs the cost, and decides to give Hawk a pitchy stick to carry to the flame and bring back fire, no matter the possible loss of Hawk's long, beautiful beak. When Hawk returns, clutching the burning stick in his now short beak, Raven assures Hawk he's even more beautiful than he was before. This is when Raven brought fire to the world. During that geologic blink, Raven decides to give old man Ganook a visit. Raven knows the old man hoards fresh water in his house, keeping it all for himself. Raven hurries to Ganook's house and tricks that old man into running down to the beach to clean his messy backside. While Ganook rinses himself in the ebbing current, Raven steals a mouthful of fresh water and rushes to fly out the smoke hole. But Ganook catches on and runs back to his house and commands his smoke spirits to stop Raven. And as Raven struggles to escape those smoke hole spirits, his feathers put away their winter color. This is when Raven became black. Raven finally escapes, fresh water dripping from his beak. He flies over the narrow land that has always been Llangit-on-Ee. Ice sheets and glaciers dance back and forth, opening meltwater streams that fill uncovered riverbeds and rush to feed a rising ocean. Meltwater fills old lake beds and carves new ponds. Ice dams grow full and break free, and still cold water weaves through uncovered ditches, old channels, and new streams. This is when Raven gave us fresh water. Volcanoes on land and ocean floor and firestorms across a burning world thicken the air with soot and ash and dust that linger for longer than an old woman's memory. But, as with all things, soot and ash and dust become stories told by caves and tephra and wind. Warm, generous air rises in a cooling night, carrying the land's dampened breath that gathers and forms to become mist and water and rain, precious rain, and opens a glimpse of moon and stars, and finally, after no more than several generations, a pine needle falls into fresh water, flowing in stream beds and riverbeds only recently revealed. And Raven tosses stars and moon and sun into a diurnal sky. This is when Raven brought back the stolen light. Along a salt water, fresh water, intertidal back and forth muck holding everything that ever lived, dotted with seaweed, beach grass, rocks and caves and cliffs, came the never-before stench of distant thunder, a taste of burning lava, thoughts of fire. Bashful sun and moon couldn't satisfy those flooding tides. It's as though Raven had something else in mind. It's as though Raven told stories wrapped in metaphor and rooted in place. It's as though Raven's stories would last 10,000 years. It's as though his stories describe our place in the world. Since time immemorial, wolves and ravens have shared a narrow, shaded, still cold land and narrow, precious fresh water with bear, raven, and living ocean. It's an ancient story that connects us to unmeasured time. Along the saltwater, freshwater, intertidal back and forth muck that holds everything that ever lived. Along a shore dotted with seaweed, beach grass, rocks and caves and cliffs. Witnessed and told by women and men, old and young, who take refuge in storytelling caves. Women and men whose stories of fire and darkness will be told for 10,000 years. Along that storied shore, Raven walks along the beach. Gunachish, thank you.
Now? Yeah, all right. Do we have questions? Wrong question. What questions do you have?
I am so
Ernestine.
interested in whether the what do you call it when two things happen? It's not really correlation, but it starts the what? Yeah, that of both, that these histories are telling of the same events, and I'm so interested in whether that came through, that our Raven stories are telling of the same events that Western science keepers tell, and they each fulfill a certain need, a certain human need, and they're not in conflict. They support one another. They complete one another. So I'm really interested in your thoughts about that and whether it actually even came through what I was trying to say.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a student here at UAS, and it was a pleasure listening to your essay.
Thank you.
I do think that the synchronicity. Let's just use that word again. What did come through?
Okay.
Although if I was writing it, I would have done a more of a back and forth thing where you describe the Western view and then describe the Tlingit view of the same event.
Oh,
Is how I personally would have done that,
Yeah.
but it works either way.
Okay.
And I think it was a very well, it made sense.
Oh, good. That's the main thing, Ryan.
From a student's perspective, so.
I had so many versions. I'm sure I tried that one too.
Yeah. For sure. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and
good,
I don't
good.
think I ever fully realized the similarities between both versions of the story until you say it at the same time and realize, oh, these are literally explaining the exact same thing.
Right.
Just to different types of people. So
two different types of keeping history.
yeah, two different types of keeping history.
Yeah.
Where
Good.
I'm an education major, so if I needed to, I'd use the Tlingit stories, I'd use that with kids to explain generally, what happened, because it is generally what happened. And, using them simultaneously is something I actually never really thought of doing before.
Oh, okay.
So I'm stealing that.
Excellent.
Yeah, I really think the juxtaposition of the two stories came across really well, and I especially appreciated the layers of metaphor and the images and the contrast, like between the ice fields, the glacier, and the fire, and then the blackness and the light. And those contrasts are just beautifully woven into it.
Oh, good. Thank you. I'm glad. And thank you for my string. What's it called?
Oh, it's like a ribbon.
Ribbon. Yeah, a ribbon, like a ribbon skirt, but a tote bag. Thank you.
I want to say something about the first thing you read. Is that okay?
Sure.
I know that road
Oh,
because my
you
sister
do?
lives there in the valley. I'm near the valley and used to live in Reno. But anyways, when you were reading it, first of all, I loved the way you were reading it because it was so much like a song, like song lyrics.
Thank
And I could you just need somebody that's a good guitarist, and you could like sing that thing. It's so perfect.
Fun. Thank you.
And I'll just mention that I just read something just yesterday about how the scientists have, they're looking into the sky. This is the opposite, like you're talking about the creation of land. But in the universe, they're looking with the Hubble and with the other, I'm sorry, I forget the newer one, James Webb. And they're seeing these differences in part of what they're seeing and how they map the universes. And so the scientists are going, wow, this really is a mystery at the core. Like it's what the mystics have been saying all along. And now the scientists are saying, yeah, I think it is a mystery at the core. So it's kind of like, I think
My own eyes.
Yes, the two do come
My
together.
own thought. They're not going to believe it's a mystery until they think it's a mystery.
Exactly.
First of all, I want to say it's a real honor to have you here and to listen to you. It was very beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Part of my education is that of being a scientist, but as an undergraduate, I received a degree in biology alongside a degree in literature, and my focus was on mythology. And they lived in two different parts of my brain. You know, I recognized each for the value that they had on my education and my development as a person, but I love how you brought those two sides together in your last piece. It's really nice to see them interwoven in a way that brings meaning in a third new way. So I really appreciated it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I do want to, like when we were doing a cohort, one of the other fellows in the cohort I'm in now is T.J. Young, Haida Carver from Heidelberg, and we were talking at one of the cohorts, and he mentioned that they live down at the south end of what is now Prince of Wales Island, and he was saying that in the water there, his grandfather used to tell him that you used to be able to see a totem under the water, and that made me realize that the story that belongs to the Sagwedi people, the story of Natsi Flene, and he was rescued by the sea lions and taken to a village underwater where he saw a screen. And we know that the tides, the sea level really changed at the end of the Pleistocene. So there's a whole new exploration. There's a place down in Oregon called Crater Lake, I believe. And I was reading where the indigenous people there have stories from before that was a crater. And they have stories about that. And then I read that only 2 or 3 years ago in Australia, Western scientists saw what they call firehawks taking sticks, catching them on fire to where fire is, and flying over to where there's not fire, and dropping them and starting fire and feasting on the rodents and insects and so on that run away. And what are we talking about? Like, oh, that fire, oh, hawk, yes. Our own eyes, we see it. And there's just so many, like it makes me think, you know, where I say Raven was stuck in the smoke hole, and that's when his feathers turned black because the ice was retreating, and the animals and birds no longer had to have their year-round winter color. And Raven used to be white, and then he turned black because the winter color, right? And that makes me think of stories of white buffalo. It makes me think of stories of, you know, the white bear that we see. There's just indigenous oral tradition has been mainly interpreted as myth and just fable. When really we look at it and we see those stories are 10,000 years old, and they are talking about events that happened that have lived for 10,000 years. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on like that. I'm going to write about it.
Ganeshtish, it was a true pleasure to listening to you, and not only your story and your writing and your essay, just the way that you read it, it's just like sits on my heart, really, just so sweet. Thank you. My question is, if any time in your research, and because I did not grow up with the stories, but the first time I heard about the Raven stories, it kind of came to me as like a more spiritual stories, as being more literal. So I was wondering if this came up in your exploring the stories anytime, as of like this might be more as of different teachings that came to Tlingit community.
Well, my theory, and it's only mine, I haven't really heard anyone else say anything like it, but I prefer to believe that what might be considered supernatural beings in different cultures, in some of them, if not most, represent nature. I believe that Raven represents the natural world to us, unpredictable, generous, tricky, you know, floods one day, sunshine the next. That can only be Raven. And there are other places in the world where their higher beings aren't like Raven, are harsh, are you know, hold back, and are you know, kind of just very, very difficult to live with, you know, and judgmental, and you're going to die, and you better watch out if you don't walk right, and like that, which could could, to me, reflect a harsher environment, an environment that isn't as generous and unpredictable as Raven, but still is a beautiful natural part of the world, and what emerged from that part of the world was different from Raven, but still represents the natural world. So that's what I think Raven is for us. I think Raven embodies our place. Right?
Well, perhaps that's a nice place to close, given that our place tonight is somewhat unpredictable. If everyone could join me once again in thanking Ernestine for sharing her stories that are wrapped in metaphor and grounded in place. Thank you so much.
Hi. Oh.
Take cookies, take candy.